So, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the very first French Entree Property webinar. Hopefully this will be the first in a series of webinars, but consider this the pilot episode, and whether we get a full series commissioned will really depend on how well this goes this morning. This is the first time we've done this, so be gentle and bear with us. I think we've hopefully ironed out any technical glitches, and hopefully we can have a really useful, informative session this morning. It's great to have so many people joining us from around the world this morning. I know that we've got not just people from France and the UK, but the States, Australia, and lots of different countries, regardless of what time of day it is where you are, whether you're having a cup of tea or a glass of Bordeaux or a gin. We welcome you as you sit down and spend a couple of hours with us this morning as we delve into the world of buying French property. It is going to be fast and furious. There's a lot of ground to cover. It is a massive topic, and we're going to break it down hopefully into some useful bite-sized nuggets for you with our experts throughout the morning. My name's Alistair Lockhart. I'm the Property Director of FrenchEntrée. I'm going to be your host for this morning's session. And FrenchEntrée has been the leading resource for buying a property and living in France since 2003. And we work with a network of property agents over in France, as well as subject matter experts in the field of financial services, legal, currency, and a whole range of services that we can introduce our clients to. FrenchEntrée is part of the France Media Group, which is a specialist publisher. Normally, we would be based in Bath, which is where our head office is, but as you can see, we're not in Bath for obvious reasons, and we are a global publisher of a number of different very successful print and digital titles, covering everything to do with France, whether it's gastronomy or travel and tourism, leisure, and of course the reason why we're here today is French property and living in France. So you may be here because you are a subscriber to the FrenchEntrée magazine, an excellent quarterly publication, or you might have been consuming some of our newsletters over time, or maybe you've just inquired about a couple of French properties. But either way, we're very grateful to have you here this morning. With me this morning, as you can see, we have a number of experts who are going to be going through the morning session with you. We've got a number of heavyweights within the French property sector. We worked out this week that between us, for the statisticians amongst you, we worked out this week that between us we have over 100 years of collective knowledge of the French property market. So hopefully we can share some of the nuggets that are rattling around in our head. And if you walk away from this in 90 minutes having learned absolutely nothing from us, then we have singularly failed. But hopefully that won't be the case. I'd like to briefly introduce our panel, and then I'll just explain the format of this morning before we kick off. So this morning we've got Mar Bonin-Palmer from Moneycorp, foreign exchange specialists, who are going to, and Mar's going to talk through how you can make sure you get the most euros for your money, and also how to avoid or make the best of, conversely, any fluctuations in currency. We've got Simon Conn, the overseas mortgage specialist. Simon, I don't think he'll mind me saying, is a veteran of the French property market with 30 years experience. I've known Simon for 15 years, and he's going to talk us through the logistics of getting a mortgage in France. And the current context that we're in. We've got Dan Harris, who is a partner at Stone King law firm, and Dan's team specialise in advising on overseas property transactions as well as succession planning, which is very important in France, as you may know. And last but not least, we've got Sheila Gorham from Agence Newton, who are one of FrenchEntrée's long-standing partners over in France, and Sheila runs a large agency which covers all of the popular areas of France, and Sheila's going to talk to us about the French property market, what the peculiarities of buying and selling in the midst of a global pandemic, and how you do that, which is uniquely challenging, as well as the B word, which we all seem to have forgotten about until now, but is looming, which is Brexit, and how that's going to affect British property buyers in particular over the next 6 to 12 months. In terms of the format, we have scheduled for about 90 minutes, so we hope that you can stay with us until the very end. We don't want it to feel like a lecture series where you're just being spoken at. We want it to be as engaging and as interactive as possible. So there will be a couple of polls throughout the session, the obligatory polls that come with doing a webinar, where we just pick your brains about a couple of things and get your input on a couple of questions. Critically, you can ask questions. There's a Q&A function within Zoom. So on top of the presentations that the speakers are about to give, you should take this opportunity to pick the brains of our experts by using the Q&A function to ask anything that's on your mind, what's keeping you awake, what can't you work out, what's bothering you. And throughout the course of the morning, we will put as many of those questions as we can to our speakers. I don't imagine we'll get through all of them, but we'll certainly try and put as many of them as we can to our speakers. And then if we've got time permitting at the end, we'll open up everybody's mic and we'll do, fastest finger and try and rattle through as many of them as we can. So before we go to our first speaker, who will be Mar from Moneycorp, we thought it'd be quite useful to kick off just to talk to somebody who is experiencing buying a property in France at the moment. And so the one name that I haven't mentioned yet is Guy Hibbert. We thought we'd take advantage of the incredible coincidence, not designed at all, that the founder of France Media Group and FrenchEntrée is and has been over the last few months buying a property in France. And so Guy's very kindly agreed to come on this morning and give us a few minutes of his time. To talk about his experience. So, Guy, good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks for joining us this morning. Normally, I'd see you every week, but I haven't literally seen you for months.
Yeah, it's good to see you.
It's genuinely lovely to see you. So, a couple of quick questions. So, can you just talk us through when you first started looking for a property?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, and I'll say good morning to everybody first of all, and perhaps just 60 seconds to say that I started FrenchEntrée in 2003, having persuaded my wife by writing down the answers to 100 questions she had that we should take our young daughter and go and live in France for a few years, and it was the experience of trying to answer those questions that led me to create a website, very much as a hobby, I have to say, to help people with their move and answer all their questions. And from that came FrenchEntrée and everything else we've done since. So do be careful what hobbies you take up when you move to France or buy a house. Yeah, so I'd be delighted to tell you, I've been given 10 minutes and I normally need 2 hours for my Confessions of a French Property Addict, which is definitely what I am. Perhaps I can do that another time.
Yeah, you don't have 2 hours.
No, you've made it quite clear. But it is actually the 5th transaction I've been involved in since 2003. So apart from contributing handsomely to the French state, I have actually experienced purchases of very different kinds in the countryside. I can't say I can speak for buying in the city. In terms of the recent past, we were actually looking until summer last year for a rather historic manor house in the Dordogne in which to run some creative courses. But I had a sort of revelation along the way, not being quite as young as I was, decided that my, what I call wide-on mower years were over. And basically, to cut a long story short, we took the budget that would buy us 300 square meters, several barns and several acres over to Nice, and have been in the process and are due to complete next month on a village house. That's what happens with your budget when you go from the west coast to the Côte d'Azur. A kind of lock up and leave property in a village near Nice. So we started looking at that sort of property the tail end of last year before the coronavirus outbreak. We were fortunate to be able to view properties in February, sun was shining, people were on the beach in Villefranche, what I call perfect estate agent weather. And we found somewhere, and I have to say the process has been pretty successful despite everything. I guess we were fortunate that we were able to view twice just before lockdown, and we're hoping to be able to sign kind of just after lockdown, but a little bit of that depends on the government's policies.
So comparing this purchase with the ones that you've done before, has anything sort of stood out to you as being particularly challenging or difficult?
Well, I have to say the notaire we're using, and this is the first time we've been involved with 2 notaires, and that's been entirely smooth. I have to say they've been really switched on to everything, and I think experience what I've seen of the way the French government has got themselves organised, comparison to the UK, is remarkable. And they put in place a number of initiatives to do with electronic communications. We were able to have our compromis de vente signed by proxy. We were able to have our 10-day cooling off period acknowledgement signed digitally. All of that has gone incredibly well. We're still hoping that we can get out there and physically be there for signing, but if not, again, it can be done by proxy. So I think buying a smaller property has meant that we haven't had that feeling or need to go back and see it. I'm thinking back to bigger places we've owned. You know, we were always going back and thinking, where was that window? And, you know, well, I wonder if we can put an extension on that barn, or, you know, there were always the need to go back and visit. Now, that would have been quite problematic. But I think for anybody who's looking to buy now, things are opening up. Hopefully we won't have the dreaded second wave. And there's every reason to feel that in the coming months, you know, people would be able to make those repeat visits if they needed to. So I have to say it's been remarkably smooth. On the mortgage and currency side, I mean, that tends to have been done very much kind of by email and phone communication in the past anyway. So again, we've used digital signatures for anything really important, but that's gone pretty smoothly too.
Excellent. And lastly, before we move on to Mar, if you had one bit of advice, one nugget of wisdom from all of your years of buying property in France, what would it be?
Well, Alistair, I'm keeping an eye on the time, and I see I actually have time for more than one bit of advice, so I'm sorry about this, but I'm going to share a couple of pieces of advice before you move on to Mar.
The running order was just a guideline.
Oh, well, you know, I've still got the 2 hours to go on my confessions. Yeah, I think I can distill it down maybe to 3 most important pieces of advice, which won't take very long to explain. And again, they're based very much on buying property in the countryside in France. The notaire is not the same thing as your UK solicitor or potentially your advisor in Australia or the US. The notaire acts for the French state. It's extremely efficient, but you do need to also make your own inquiries, and the best place to start is the local mairie. You must go down there in person, in my view, and ask them in particular to see the communal plan for your village. The communal plan will show you what building, what permissions are being granted, what future plans they have. And from personal experience, we didn't realise that some properties were going to be built near the first house we bought. It was not the notaire's job to tell us, and we assumed that that would be something that would come up in the search stage of the process. So apart from all the other useful advice that the mairie will give you about, you know, recycling and everything else, I totally urge you to do that and make friends as well. Secondly, when it comes to the actual contractual side of things, I've found that in France, boundaries and property rights can quickly become potential issues for people. You need to pay attention to 2 words, which may appear in your compromis de vente, and that is servitude and droit de passage. Servitudes are mutual agreements with a neighbour which would allow someone to put up a ladder and fix a roof, or attend to a party wall, or things like that. For some reason, French get very worked up about this kind of thing, and you don't want to end up with a neighbourly dispute. So it's best to pay attention to that. Droit de passage, for you who may not speak French, is a right of passage, which simply means make sure a local farmer has not got 150 years worth of rights to drive his tractor through your garden to carry out his harvest or something like that. As long as you pay attention, and perhaps if you're concerned and nervous and you have a property that's got some potential complications, then a legal advisor like Dan would be able to look at that, carry out the necessary translations and advise you. These are things to look at up front, clearly. I'll sort of give you 3 bits. I think Ma will probably like to hear this, I know she will, but hand on heart, this is something that I have, through bitter experience, learned. You are going to be buying in Australian dollars, US dollars, or British pounds a property, an asset that is in euros. You are therefore subject to currency fluctuations. And between the time you negotiate the price and agree the price of the property and the time you have to hand over your hard-earned money, which could be many months, the currency exchange is going to fluctuate. The simplest way to avoid a lot of sleepless nights, potential nagging from your partner or other half that we should have done this or we should have done that, the best thing to do is to forward book your money, your currency, at a rate that you can obtain pretty much on the day you agree to buy the property, so that you know when the time comes you will get the property at that rate. Now, along the way, you may see the currency go up and down, and you may think, oh, I could have got a better rate, I could have saved myself some money. But I can promise you it's much better than the horrors of seeing it going up and down for several months, and you're kind of going, oh no, should have done this, should have done that earlier, shall we wait, should we not wait? That's my final piece of advice. I have booked the cash element of our purchase was booked a few days after we agreed the price. So I'm quite happy about that, especially as I got a reasonable rate, and I'm looking at the British economy and expecting it only to go in one direction at the moment, which means the pound will probably also go in one direction. So I hope that's useful, and good luck to everybody. Looking forward to the rest of this seminar, this webinar.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Guy. That's been very useful. Feel free to hang around, but I know that you might have a date with the exercise bike that's just behind you.
I'll switch the video off.
Feel free to jump off. And thanks very much for coming in this morning.
That's a pleasure. If anybody has any questions for me, I'm not an expert. I'm a big picture person. I'm happy to share any experiences. Just email me, guy@francemedia.com anytime.
That's great. Thanks very much, Guy. So without any further ado, Guy is bang on time, which is, brilliant. I'd like to introduce now Ma Bonin-Palmer from Moneycorp. Over to you, Ma.
Hello. So, well, Guy has delivered half of my presentation. Thank you, Guy. But it's a good intro because I'm going to be speaking about an element that can have a massive impact on your property purchase. And therefore, it's very important to take it into consideration. Often, even if the risk, as I'm going to explain to you, is quite obvious, this element is forgotten or lost in translation. So, as I said, very important to take it into consideration. I'm talking about the foreign exchange element, or the fact that exchange rates are constantly fluctuating, and with these fluctuations and with these movements, that could affect and could alter your budget and the price you're paying for your property. Most of you, I think, as Alistair said, are buying from the US, from the UK, from Australia. All of you will have to pay for the property in France in euros, and because you're holding your funds in a different denomination, at some point you will have to press that button, change your funds into euros. And what we are looking today is what is the risk that this could involve in your property purchase. To do so, I'm going to show you an example that I have prepared. I'm going to share my screen with you. This example is showing you a little bit what is the volatility that we have had with the sterling euro in the last year, and I'm going to concentrate very much on the last 3 months. Through an example that you can all probably relate to is the example of Mr. and Mrs. Jones, a couple from the UK, and they dream of buying a property in France, and with that dream they travel on February to Normandy to view a property. We found a lovely property near Granville for a price tag of 250,000 euros. They like the property, they like the price, they put an offer in, the offer is immediately accepted. And with this in mind, they go back to the UK, very excited about the prospect of owning a property in France. At the time when they arrive to the UK, they make their calculations and they look at the rate. The rate at the time is at 120, which means that that property in France is going to cost them £208,000. They are very happy. The price is well within their budget of £215,000. In fact, it gives them a little bit extra to pay for their notary fees, for that renovation or some extra cost. A couple of weeks later, they are being given the compromis de vente. They carry some searches, everything is in place, the cooling period passes, and they have to pay the 10% deposit. 25,000 euros, they don't think about it twice, they make a transfer through their bank without really looking at the rate. The rate at the time has started to drop. In fact, a month later, or after they have found that property, the rate dropped to 105. Which means that suddenly that property is going to cost them £30,000 more than what they initially planned. A couple of months later, and after a bit of a delay due to the current pandemic, they are being asked to complete on the property, sign the title deeds before the notaire, and pay for the balance of the purchase price, which at the time, due to the rate fallen to 112, is the equivalent of £223,000. £15,000 more than when they initially planned, and £8,000 above the original budget. So this example illustrates the cost or the risk that foreign exchange can have on your purchase. In this particular case, £15,000. Very important to bear in mind that the final price that you are going to pay for that property will entirely depend on the rate of exchange that you have on the day that you made a payment or change that funds. So it's something that you need to bear in mind since the very beginning. Rates are constantly fluctuating, especially as you will see in a second when I give you a bit of a market update in the climate that we have right now. So what can you do in order to keep this fluctuation under control, in order to avoid that these negative fluctuations end up ruining your purchase in France? I'll give you a couple of tips. This is not an exhaustive list, but hopefully it will help you a little bit to navigate this world. First, set up a budget. A budget will help you with your search of property. It will allow you to know what properties you can afford, where to look. Furthermore, incorporate that FX or that foreign exchange element into your budget will help you with these fluctuations and with planning the best way to change your funds. How do we do this? I think that guy illustrated very well the fact that because the rates are constantly fluctuating in this market, there's always regrets. After you've taken your decision, the rates are still going to be moving. So when can I know when a rate is good, when is the right time? It is very difficult and can be very overwhelming. For me, in the 13 years experience that I have with Monicorp, the best thing to do is to have a budget or have a range in mind. So let's say I find the property to buy right now where the rate is 112. I can afford that property. I can afford this 112. But I'm positive that the rate may get a bit better. Ideally, it will get a bit better. So I said, I can afford 112, but I will ideally change my funds on 115. I also bear in mind that the rate suddenly can drop. And there's a point in which if it drops beyond that point, I am not going to be able to afford the purchase, or the purchase is going to be far too expensive for me. And that point for me is 110. So with this in mind, I set up my budget and I set up a range of 110, 115. The closer to get to 115, the happier I am. I cannot go beyond 110. And I know that if I buy my currency in between these two brackets, I'm happy. No regrets. The second tip that I'm going to give you is to obtain a good rate of exchange, which sounds quite obvious. I think it's very well known these days that high street banks don't always offer you the most competitive rate of exchange. Foreign exchange specialist companies such as Moneycorp sometimes can offer you savings on 2 to 4% on the rate that a high street bank will give you, with lower charges and sometimes not even transfer fees on their payments. So as you can see in the example that we're seeing, regardless of where the rate, where is the market at the time, a foreign exchange specialist can actually save you money. And then the third tip will be to get some guidance on the best way to exchange your funds. As you have seen in the example, as important as it is to get a good exchange rate, it is to get the timing right. I'm often being asked, how far in advance do I need to look into the exchange rate? How far in advance do I have to speak to you? I haven't even found the property. And my answer is always the same. Get familiar with the rates early in the process. It will help you to set up your budget. It will help you to know what is the best way to make that transfer, and that will depend entirely on your circumstances, your deadline, your budget. A foreign exchange specialist will offer you a competitive rate of exchange, will give you some free guidance on the market, but also will give you a wider range of tools and options to buy your currency. I think that Guy mentioned a forward contract, which I was going to briefly describe, because it is a very popular tool or a very popular contract amongst those looking to buy a property abroad. A forward contract allows you to set up the rate of exchange in advance of a payment. And the reason why it's popular with property purchases, with overseas purchase, is because it allows you to have this peace of mind of knowing how much that property is going to cost you. We have buyers that do this as soon as they sign the compromise on. They set the whole price, the whole rate, and they know exactly how much is this property going to cost them, with irrelevance of the fluctuation. But also, it's used by property buyers to take advantage of a sudden movement on the rate. So let's say that I found my property at 112, and while I'm waiting for completion, suddenly that rate goes to 115. I'm not going to complete yet, but I want to take advantage of that rate. So I lock my full price at 115. And I know I have bought at my top range, and also I don't have to worry about the fluctuations. Finally, I'm just going to speak a little bit about what is happening in the market. I know that some of you are very concerned. Some of you may be in the middle of buying a property and looking to complete. The completion may have been delayed. Some of you may be at the very early stages. There is no doubt that the current pandemic has put a lot of pressure on all the economies around the world, and has added this extra layer of uncertainty on a market that is already, in normal circumstances, quite volatile. And that makes planning and forecasting very difficult for all of us. On the top of it, if you are in the UK, you have an extra risk or an extra layer there to take into consideration, an extra element that is Brexit. Brexit is back on the table, and Brexit negotiations, especially this month, are going to very much define the value of the pound. The closer we are to the possibility of getting a deal, we're going to see probably sterling taking advantage of that. If we get closer to a no deal, the pound is going to lose some strength there. The good news there is that because the European economy and the UK economy are already under a lot of pressure due to the pandemic, there's more willingness probably to get some compromises and get a deal. And experts believe that if there is a deal on the table, the pound should win some ground against the euro. If you are in the US dollar has been holding in general terms quite strong against major currencies during the whole pandemic. The reason why is because normally when there is a bit of an international crisis or a bit of negative global sentiment in the market, investors tend to keep their funds in what we call a safe haven currency, and US dollar is one of them. So we see people bringing the money and keeping them in US dollars, and normally the US dollar remains quite strong. However, we've seen, especially since late May, the dollar actually is still now happening, getting weaker against major currencies such as the euro or the pound. Main reasons behind that is there is better confidence in the market. There is a bit of appetite for risk. The confidence is starting to get back as we see that the economies are starting to get out of their lockdown. Also, the policy of the Feds or the policy in the US with quantitative easing and cutting interest rates is affecting the value of the US dollar. And also the social unrest that we have had in the last couple of weeks due to the incident, the sad incidents in Minneapolis, that has also affected the currency, and is likely to affect the coming elections, and all of this is going to have an impact on the currency. I cannot go into more detail, but if you're holding different currency, you have any questions about the specific currencies I talk about, please feel free to send your questions to Alistair. Final thoughts, always account for that element of foreign exchange and get guidance. Don't leave it for the last minute, because as you have seen, it can have a massive impact and a big cost for your property. And just to finish on a positive, when we talk about foreign exchange, we always talk about the risks and the negative fluctuations. Always take into account that the rates are moving, and foreign exchange can be a risk, but also can pose an opportunity to maximize your budget. And that's all for me. I think I'm going to pass it to Alistair with some questions, and then to Simon helping you with financing. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Mar. That's excellent. You can breathe for a second. So the questions are coming in thick and fast from the audience, which is great. So from my perspective, just from a technical perspective, I'm relieved to see it's working. So a couple of quick questions for you, Mar. If you book, so there's a question here: if you book a forward currency rate and the rates improve, what percentage fee would you end up paying for switching out of the booked rate and into the new and better rate?
Well, we don't have a fixed margin. Literally, when you book a forward contract or when you book your rate, it's like if I go to the market and actually buy that currency for you. So often buyers are asking, what will happen if the rate improves? Would I be able to switch that rate? The answer is no. When you get into a forward contract, the forward contract will hold that rate until the contract comes to maturity. If by any chance you want to cancel that contract or get out of that contract, in each particular case, there's going to be literally, we're going to take that currency and try to sell it back to the market. It could have happened that the rate has moved, or we will always work with the buyer to try to make sure that we minimize the loss, but the loss is going to be defined basically with the market, where the market is.
Okay, great, thank you. There's a question here from Eric, and Eric wants to know what security there is for the money which is given to the currency trader. I'm sure you've come across this before. What happens, if somebody is using a currency broker and the currency broker goes into administration before the funds are paid out? What happens then?
Well, I will say that when you're looking at currency providers, you need to always make sure of two things. One, that the currency provider has to be FCA regulated and authorized to make sure that all their processes are actually, in sync with the Financial Conduct Authority and they're secure. And secondly, we are not a bank. However, best way to know that your foreign exchange provider is operating securely is to make sure that the funds of private clients are actually held on segregated account. Very much situation very much as it happens with lawyers. The money of our clients is not mixed with business. Furthermore, foreign exchange specialists such as Monaco, we don't speculate in the market. All we do is we buy currency when there is a reason for trade. So therefore, we minimize the risk of taking any positions in the market that could mean us being affected by this movement. The money is held on a segregated account. So if the company by any chance goes into liquidations, that funds will be secure.
Okay, great. And I've got one more question for you before we move on to Simon. There are a couple more currency questions, but what we'll do is we'll sweep those up in the end when we do our quick fire round. Okay, so one last question now for you, Mar. With a forward contract, do I keep the money in my British bank account until the moment of putting down a deposit and final payment?
Forward contract, if you book a forward contract with us, you don't need to pay us the full amount of money. The money can be held on your British account. In fact, it's the beauty of a forward contract that some people may not have availability of funds at the time of locking the rate, and they can still take advantage of that. The only thing is that when you book a forward contract, you will be asked to pay a 10% deposit. This is not a charge. It's only purely a deposit to guarantee that rate. It's going to be deducted from the full deal. So your funds can remain with you until the contract comes to maturity, and then you will need to transfer the rest of the balance of the sterling into our account. We will exchange them into euros at the agree rate and then transfer them to France or whatever you want us to transfer them to.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So
I just wanted to, sorry, Alice, I just wanted to mention, I can see some of the audience is having problems with the volume. I hope you haven't had problems understanding me, or I'm going to be looking into that. I don't know if it's a problem of the panel or my problem, but I apologize if there has been any technical issues with my audio.
No, that's fine. It sounds a little bit warbly, but I think we got most of what you were saying. And just to make the point, which I did forget to say at the beginning, is that this is recorded and will be sent out to everybody who has registered as an attendee. So if you miss anything as we rattle through this morning's content, you can always watch it at your leisure later on in the week. Just before we go to Simon, we're just going to launch our first poll now. So this is a very quick question to the audience. So you've got 30 seconds. I'm going to launch the poll, answer the question, and then we'll share the results with you immediately as soon as we've done that. So question 1 is, what is the main reason for your property purchase? So what is the main reason? So you may be buying for a couple of different reasons, but what's the main reason? Is it a main residence? Are you looking to emigrate to France? Are you looking for a holiday home or a secondary residence? Or are you looking at France purely from an investment perspective? So in true Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, Ask the Audience style, press your buttons. And we've got 5 seconds left, a few seconds left to vote. And I am going to end the, we're still, I was going to go to 30 seconds, but there's still a few latecomers clicking. I think we're stalling there, so I'm going to end the polling. So there we go. So the main reason for your property purchase, as you can see hopefully on your screen now, so 64% of our audience are buying for their main residence, so presumably looking to emigrate to France and live permanently there. 35% are looking for a holiday home, and a cheeky little 1% are looking at France from an investment perspective. So thank you very much everybody for taking part in our poll. These things do tend to go cyclically. Some years are predominantly holiday homes, some years are predominantly immigration, but I think, you know, given a number of different factors that are happening at the moment, it's no great surprise to me that immigration and looking to move permanently to France, where there is a lot more space to socially distance, by the way, is looking quite popular. So I would now like to introduce Simon Conn. I'm just going to see if I can unmute Simon, and welcome Simon to the conversation. Simon, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So, get my screen. Okay. Right, technically, hello everybody. Welcome to the talk about mortgages. For those of you who don't know me, I've been in the industry over 35 years now, arranging mortgages all around the world. And France is probably one of the top 5 countries that I get involved with, and probably the most popular. So why do people buy in France? People buy in France because the interest rates are low, like with the rest of Europe. We're seeing interest rates, I'll discuss that later when I go through the mortgage terms. There's a large diversity of regions to purchase in. We have a different type of purchaser who will buy in the north compared to the south. And so it gives a good, and it's always been a good thermometer for me to know if the industry is very busy. And at the moment, it is very busy. We're getting inquiries from all around the world, but France is probably one of the busiest. And because it's got such a range of areas to buy and quite a wide range of lending sources as well, that helps. It's not far to travel for a lot of people within Europe. Of course, we are talking to people around the world. I do understand that, but for a lot of people within Europe, it hasn't been too easy to get to in cheap flights. It has shown good rental return, especially in certain areas. Although it's quite interesting from that poll that I would agree with that a lot of people tend to buy either for holiday home or retirement as opposed to investment. It's an interesting market. If you're buying a larger property, it's worthwhile talking to tax advisors and lawyers to see about whether it can help you. That's not my area, but it can reduce the wealth tax because you only pay on the net, not the gross on when you sell the property. Cooling off periods, put that in there because what I found with France compared to some of the other countries, you have two key very cooling off periods. One, when you sign the sales contract, you have a time when you can change your mind when you decide to buy the property. And secondly, when you get the mortgage, you also have another cooling off period, which is quite unusual compared to other countries. Negatives, I haven't come across many negatives. I've dealt with France for over 30, 35 years, and I've always found it quite an easy country to deal with, as long as you understand, and we'll go through other aspects of buying a property abroad. If you take all those points into account, it can be quite a good country to purchase in. And what we have found is more high owners are still coming back into the market, and we are finding that the south is getting busier. So I had to reduce one screen. I can't see on my screen. So what's the current lending terms? So basically at the moment, we're seeing the loan to value, it's around about 75 to 80. We have seen a slight drift down over the last few months, basically because of COVID has affected money markets. And we were looking at higher loan to values and we expect that to come back into the autumn. But at the moment, we're saying 75 to 80% loan to value. Maximum term of years is normally 25 up to age 70. It can be longer. We have seen mortgages at longer rates, but it will all depend on what your pension and investment income is after retirement. Minimum term 5 years, minimum purchase price, and that can vary. We've said the minimum there is 100,000 if employed or 120,000 if self-employed. Those values do go up if you're aged over 50 because there's a limited time from age 50 to retirement. So they have put up the minimums on that as well. Minimum loan, same 50, 80,000 if you're self-employed, if you're employed, 100,000 if self-employed. Again, those change again if you're age over 50, but by all means you can contact me, we can go through those on a case-by-case basis. Interest rates are subject to that. It's very difficult to tie down an actual interest rate at the moment because it will vary depending on all these different factors. The amount you're borrowing, what the actual purchase price, what the actual eventual loan to value, where you're buying, because we've got regional banks as well as national banks we deal with. And when you're dealing with loans over $1 million, we've even got banks from outside France lending into there. We've got banks in Switzerland, Monaco and Luxembourg that will also take a view on loans over $1 million. So what's the most common questions that get asked about French mortgages? Well, I've been asked a question now about COVID. Will there be new criteria? Nothing much has changed, but as I explained just now on the mortgages, we have seen a slight dip on the maximum loan to values as banks take a view on what's going to happen in the money markets. But hopefully by the autumn, with the virus diminishing, that will hopefully go back up. Timescales, we try to aim for 3 months. That's what we try and aim for to get the mortgage through. It could be quicker, but it all depends on a lot of factors. It depends on how quickly you get the paperwork back to the lender, how quickly the survey is done, and how quickly the legal process. And those factors have to also be taken into account with holidays. There are quite a few holidays in Europe, and August, of course, is always a bad month when a lot of some lawyers close, some surveyors' offices close. So we always say that if you're starting a mortgage around about May, June, then try and aim for a mid-September autumn date completion rather than around the summer dates when a lot of offices may be closed. Are there penalties if you move away? It depends on what type of contract you've taken from the beginning. If you've got a variable rate mortgage, then of course most of those don't have a redemption penalty. If you have taken a fixed rate, then you just have to speak to your lender, but there normally will be a penalty because lenders had to go into the money markets to get that mortgage to fix it at the beginning, so that there will be a penalty if you have to stop it halfway through. Why is the minimum loan? Part of the reason is because on the smaller contracts, if you go back 4 or 5 years ago, we were lending at 30,000, 50,000 euros properties, but we had a lot of problems with those. Some people were not paying their mortgage when they got into problems, and the cost of administration, cost of looking after that type of mortgage and chasing a client for debt for a loan of under 80,000 could be quite costly. So they just decided to put a minimum in. What's the main 3 things to get ready of evidence? Well, basically is to make sure that you have all your 3 years income history, be it whether you're self-employed or employed, so that the bank can see a whole history of where you've been working. If you have changed jobs within those 3 years, it's good to get a CV put together as well to show a 3-year employment history. Make sure you've got the personal contribution that you need. And as I said before, you've got to have the deposit, but you've also got to have the setting up costs, and the lawyers can go through with you because it can vary. We say roughly around about 10% of the purchase price is you've got to allow on top to cover the government taxes and legal fees, but it does vary from region to region. And then lastly is making sure you've got all your bank statements and mortgage statements ready for the lender to look at. And why should you use a broker instead of a bank? Well, if you go to a bank, you've only got one choice, and that one limited to one area. And when we did in France, we've got not only the national banks, but we've got regional banks near to where you're buying that we can talk to. And as I said, on the million plus loans, we've also got banks from outside of the area that may lend into those countries, into France as well. So top tips. Now I'm going to share, as I said, I've been doing this a long time. Some of these points don't all apply to France, but they apply to the overseas market. Always give yourself a calling off period. You know, you've gone out there, you've decided to go and buy a property abroad, have a think about it, talk to other people before you make a decision and sign contracts. It may sound quite obvious, check the translation of what you're signing, and if an English version is sure it's true translation of the original. I'm flabbergasted about how many people who go and buy property abroad, they don't check what they're signing. They may sign it in a foreign language, or they may sign an English version without checking if it is actually matching what the French version is, for example. Try and arrange your mortgage in principle, which we can do. If you've got an idea of what you're looking for and where you're looking for, we can actually arrange a loan or give you a quote to give you an idea of what you can possibly borrow. Of course, then you've got to put all your supporting documentation in, so there is another hurdle to go through, but at least give you an idea based on the initial information. Try and arrange your mortgage in the currency that you can. That may not be possible in some countries, because if you borrow, say for example in France, they will normally lend in euros, but a lot of people rent the property and then they can offset one against the other. Ensure you have an opt-out clause that not is agreed. So it's very important that if you come to sign a contract, that you put in there that it's subject to mortgage finance, and that will give you if there's a problem later on, either with the mortgage, unfortunately you may get turned down, or that there's a survey problem and the bank go out and survey it, or if there's a legal problem, the property they find, then you hopefully be able to recover your deposit. But speak to your French lawyer and getting the terms right before you actually sign the contract. Take independent legal and tax advice. This is so important. It's one of my top 3, as well as the translation, is make sure that you get an independent lawyer to work on a side of the bank to make sure you get all the advice. And take tax advice, because you're buying in a different jurisdiction. We've got a list. We've got lawyers and tax advisors in those countries that we can put you in touch with if you haven't got one already. Arrange your own survey if the bank's not doing it. The bank will do their own survey to make sure it's good for security. But if it's an older property, especially, you may want to get an independent surveyor done just to make sure it's built properly. And even if it's a new build, we've had situations on new build properties where it all looks nice, white and shiny, and then the foundations, which should have gone down 20 feet, have only gone down 8 to 10 feet. And if you're in a very hot country and those properties are situated in the clay soil, you could have the situation, of course, that it could get cracking and subside at a later date. Other points to consider: make sure, again, this is all down with the surveyor, as the solicitor can check a lot of these, whether the property has been built properly, whether it's got all the planning permissions and licensings, was the extension put on there with all the permissions. Is the price true? You know, look at comparables, do your research before you go around, look at other properties in the area. full title ownership, are you allowed to sell? Is it multi-owned? We have come across properties where there's co-ownerships. So the land is and the properties are shared, and what you're buying is what you thought was just yours. You're only actually buying 1/3 of that property. So again, go back to the lawyer, make sure you understand what you're buying. How's it built? What materials are being used? Is it of good standard? Will it see the test of time? What amenities are you getting? If you're buying on a new build, especially, you know, you were promised on that whole development, you're going to get a golf course, you're going to get restaurants, you're going to get a hotel. And if they weren't built, what compensation will you get if you don't get those amenities? Is it different to the original specifications? You know, you built to have a certain thing with a three bedroom with extension. Is it to the actual specifications you asked them to build it with? Check the reputation of the developer and agent you're buying. What have they built before? You know, have they had good sales processes? Has everything gone right from other people? You can normally do some Google searches and check out those developers and agents. And locations. I can't get this problem so much in France, but we have had situations in other areas where people have bought and found to their horror that it was previously or is a bird sanctuary, a military zone, or even a floodplain. So it's just checking that out. So thank you very much. And if there's any questions, I'm sure Alistair will pass them on to me.
Brilliant. Thank you, Simon. That's excellent work. Now, I do have a couple of questions for you. So, first question for you is, notwithstanding that the survey said that relatively few people were looking at France from an investment perspective, is there such a thing as a buy-to-let market in France? And do you think it's possible to buy one to rent out? Presumably this is not on a gîte basis, but much, you know, on a standard long-term leasing basis?
It's a good question, because the problem we have, and it's not just France but other parts of Europe, is that there isn't such a thing as a buy-to-let product, in the fact that they will take the rental income into account. France is unusual compared to its nearest partners, Portugal, Spain and Italy, where those countries won't take any of the rental income into account when they do the calculation of what you could borrow. With France, we do have lenders that will take up to 70% of both existing and new rental. And a lot of people fall into this trap, especially if you've got a very small portfolio of buy-to-lets already. Some of the lenders won't take that rental into account, or only take a proportion of that, and therefore your earned income has to be sufficient to not only cover your own personal debt, but also the rental property debt. So it's a very important point to make sure that you can do. If you've got a business, so we do get clients coming to what we call professional landlords, people who have their own business, but they've also got 15 to 20 properties and they run it as a business and they've got accounts and tax returns. That's completely different. Then we can take that whole income as if it's a business. It's where we have the problem is people come to us for an application. They've bought 3 or 4 properties over the years. We get a lot from Britain have done that, because that has been very popular. But then run into the problem that Europe says, well, I'm sorry, we're not taking that rental, or we're going to take a portion of that rental income into account.
Okay, fair enough. In general, would you say that, you know, what's most popular as a product? Is it a fixed rate or a variable rate?
It's an upside down answer, actually, because what's happening now is that the banks are not offering as many variable rate schemes. The cost of funds now in the markets, because of what's happening in the market with COVID and other things, and margins coming down, banks are tending to offer more fixed rate products, and rather not giving them the choice. You then got to watch what I said earlier, is that with a variable rate, no redemption penalties, or very few redemption penalties, whilst with a fixed rate there is. It's just the way the market's going. What may happen if that continues is that you may get what happens in the States. In the States, you can have a fixed rate product and no early redemption penalties. So I think as competition goes on, you may find that type of product developing in Europe.
Okay, great. And lastly, last question for you at the moment. Is it possible to obtain a French mortgage if one is retired but has income in the EU?
Yes, depending on your age. Depending on your age and how many
Yeah.
years you want it over.
But and on the age question, then, just as a sub question, at what age does it start to get tricky?
If you start putting an application over 65, 70, it gets more tricky. But just to answer one other question, which seems to be a fallacy in the market, we are not seeing a problem with this Brexit issue about Brits buying in the UK, in France, because as I've always said, the French have always sold to the Swiss, the Scandinavians, the Americans, the Australians and New Zealanders. The British are not going to be treated any different. I think Sheila will explain that there are things that you have to do when they come out of Brexit. That's a different matter. But there's not going to be this thing that they're not selling to the Brits. They'll be welcoming Brits as they always have.
That is excellent news. Thank you very much, Simon. That's very kind of you. We are now going to move on to Dan Harris from Stone King, who's been waiting very patiently for his turn. Dan, the floor is yours.
It's been very easy to wait patiently because the talk so far have been fascinating, and if there's one point I'd like to start off actually with is that you know, some of our key pieces of advice are: get yourself a mortgage set up before you go out and make an offer. And Simon Connor is an excellent person to be able to provide that advice. And also, you'd be absolutely crazy not to use a currency broker. The banks do not offer great rates. So, you know, we are an independent firm of solicitors, and we only provide independent advice. There's no advantage to us in making those recommendations, but it is a fact. When you're buying overseas, those are key considerations. So I'm going to share my screen with you now, which will be the presentation. Buying in France. This is an enormous topic to try and trample through in 15 minutes, but I'm going to do my best. I'm going to try not to talk too fast, but forgive me if I do. First of all, I'm going to say a few things about Stone King. We are a national firm of solicitors with 5 offices across the country. My particular team is a specialist international and cross-border team that deals with nothing but international and cross-border work. We deal with every jurisdiction in the world, but about 50% of our work involves clients with assets in France. And as well as that, there's one of my team members actually lives in France, and another one of my team members is a French national. So we're extremely well versed in this kind of work. The firm itself has been in existence for 230 years, and the only thing that might give that away is my lockdown haircut. But hopefully you'll forgive that, and we'll be able to move on. But looking at the question of buying during lockdown, this is a question that's arisen. What are the problems from a legal point of view? Well, from a legal perspective, lockdown isn't causing any problems or delays with the actual transfer of rights. Okay, we're still working, as are our cross-border notaires, and so in that respect, there are no delays. You don't need to meet us face-to-face or come into the office. Everything can be done remotely, and in fact, this is not new for us because being a firm that deals with every jurisdiction in the world, very few of our clients we actually do meet face-to-face. They come from anywhere in the world. You don't even need to go to France to sign the preliminary contract or final contracts. We can help you execute a procuration, which is a power of attorney, which enables someone in the notarial office to sign these documents on your behalf. These are the questions that are being provided by FrenchEntrée. Some quite challenging questions, as I say, to answer in such a short period of time. But first one is, how do I make sure I'm 100% protected when I sign the compromis or promesse de vente? That's the initial contract. Will I be taking out a mortgage? I will be taking out a mortgage. What happens if I fail to get finance? Will I lose my 10%? That's the deposit. Can I buy a property with friends or family members, someone who's not a spouse or a partner? I hear that's easy in France. What are the pitfalls? What do I have to think about tax-wise if I'm buying a property? I intend to run a gîte, which is a type of B&B business. Why do I need my own notaire if notaires are supposed to be impartial? And finally, is it true that I may not be able to leave my French property to whomever I wish? So dealing with the first of those questions, how do I make sure I'm 100% protected when I sign the compromis de vente or promesse de vente? Well, actually, you know, you can never be 100% protected, but you can go a long way to making sure you're as protected as you can possibly be. Now, one of the curious things about people buying property overseas is they don't seem to apply the same rules or protections to that purchase of the property as they do buying property in their own jurisdiction. It's not clear to me why that is, because the risks are actually greater. You're dealing with a different legal system. and a different language, or dealing with a different legal culture. So the people who operate in that culture, French nationals living in France, they're used to the legal system. When they go down the pub, they talk about the structure and the procedure, and they kind of understand it. They don't get everything right, because no one does in conversations down a pub, obviously, but clearly, you know, it's a different legal system. And the things that you may assume that are based on your legal system or similar to your legal system will not be the same. So a promise de vente or compromis de vente, these are preliminary contracts that you enter into, and they're signed very early in the procedure. Okay, they can't even be signed on the day you first view the property. The issue is they can be drafted by anyone, and they're often drafted by estate agents. Now, as Sheila will tell you later, as an estate agent, she recommends that they're drafted by notaires, and so do we, because they contain really important details. They contain the price, they contain details of exactly what you're buying, the size and the boundaries. Worth bearing in mind in France, actually, that there's a 5% tolerance on those boundary and size figures. They contain details of the completion date, of easements and rights of way, of co-proprietorship details, particularly where there is, if you're buying an apartment in a block. And they can contain particular conditions, which may be helpful, may not be helpful, but you need to know what they are. They're binding. Okay, you sign that contract, they're binding. So do not sign a contract, whether it's in English or in French, do not sign a contract until you've actually had someone look at it and make sure that there are no things to catch you out. With our firm, what we do is we look at all those details, and we provide the client with a report to show them exactly what the issues are. We highlight any problems, and in that way they're properly and fully informed. Second question, I'll be taking out a mortgage. What happens if I fail to get finance? Will I lose my 10% deposit? Well, the first point here is actually, it may not be a 10% deposit. It could be more or less than that, because the deposit is actually negotiable. 10%, 5% is the sort of figure that is generally put in these contracts, but it is negotiable. The answer is that you will probably lose your deposit if you fail to get a mortgage, unless you have entered in the preliminary contract a clause suspensive, which is a conditional clause. And clause suspensives can cover all sorts of different issues, but in particular, they're used to cover mortgages. So you can make an offer on a property, enter into a binding contract in respect to that offer, but the offer will be subject to you being able to get a mortgage. So if you don't get a mortgage, then provided the preliminary contract is drafted properly, you'll be able to back out. Clearly, someone like Simon Conn, he can provide you with an agreement in principle, which will certainly help, because many notaires won't even draft these documents unless the mortgage is pretty much agreed. As I say, clause suspensive can be wide-ranging. They can include a whole variety of things, including a key one as planning permission. Importantly, your purchase cannot be conditional on selling your house. Okay, so in the UK, this is a classic legal cultural difference. In the UK, we can put in our contract that you know, it's the purchase of a new property is subject to us selling our own. This is not possible in France. Okay, you have to have the funds. You have to have either sold your property or have a mortgage in place, or heaven forbid, and I would not recommend this, a bridging loan to actually be able to buy a property. So that's a major consideration for many people. Next question, can I buy a property with friends or family members, someone who's not a spouse or a partner? I hear it's easy in France. What are the pitfalls? Well, yes, it is easy in France. It's just as easy in France as it is in the UK. And you get exactly the same problems in France as you do in the UK. And these are generally not in themselves legal issues, but the sort of problems that are likely to arise are usage. So you will agree at the outset that you and the person you're buying the property with can use the property, but what about their family? What about their extended family? What about their friends? What about their friends of friends? What about when the property is going to be used? Can they use it while you're using it? Are you going to use it at different times? Are you going to agree a particular time when it can be used? Then there are property taxes. What if one of the parties decides, well, actually, do you know what? I haven't used the property much this year, so I don't think I should be paying the property taxes. You should be paying it. What about expenses, overheads? What about repairs? What about cleaning and damage? You know, what to one person, fair wear and tear may not be the same as another person. To another person, may be damage that should be repaired. tax considerations. So what do I have to think about tax-wise if I'm buying a property? And in this case, the person posing the question has said, I intend to run a gîte, which is a kind of B&B business. So there are property taxes for any property in France. There's taxe foncière and taxe d'habitation. These taxes are, in fact, one point you need to bear in mind when you're negotiating these properties is taxe d'habitation is a kind of the local equivalent to our council tax, if you like. In the case of taxe foncière, the tax is split between the parties for the entire year, so the buyer and seller. But in the case of taxe d'habitation, it actually has to be paid on January the 1st for the entire year. So that sometimes has a significant effect on when people are prepared to buy and sell a property. Having said all of that, that is negotiable like everything else. So if you get someone in early to look at the contracts, you can potentially negotiate for that particular tax to be split proportionally. Then there's capital gains tax. So if you're thinking of going to France, buying a rundown property, doing it up and making some money out of it, well, actually, not only will Sheila tell you that that's not such a good idea in France because property prices are very, very stagnant, but also different rules apply when it comes to the application of capital gains tax. So in the UK, any expenses that you incur in respect of capital gains tax can be offset against the capital gains tax. In France, they can only be offset if you're using an approved French tradesman, and also the invoice has to be in French. Income tax, you're going to have to pay income tax on the property if it's let, particularly in the case of gîtes. And not only are you going to have to pay income tax in the UK, you'll also have to pay income tax in France. There'll be a double taxation provision, and there's a double taxation convention, in fact, that you can use to offset this double pay tax. But you just need to be able to, you need to be taking proper advice on that to make sure that you're maximising the discounts that are available. Then there's also a room tax, which is paid per bed per night to the local mairie. Finally, a final point on gîtes is that they're actually very tightly regulated, much more tightly regulated than B&Bs in the UK. And one of the interesting things that my clients tell me is that those regulatory rules tend to be much more heavily applied to foreign nationals, such as UK nationals who are running gîtes, than they are applied to local nationals. Why do I need my own notaire if notaires are supposed to be impartial? And really, frankly, this one comes down to human nature. Okay, none of us are truly absolutely impartial. It's impossible for that to happen. We all have unconscious bias. So if you instruct your own notaire through us, that notaire will be looking to do the best job for you and looking after the transaction from your perspective. So actually looking after your best interests. The point here is you might think, well, hang on a second, that's going to be expensive, isn't it? Well, no, there's no additional cost because the notarial fees are set centrally by the French government. And if there are two notaires involved, then they share those expenses between them. We use specialist cross-border notaires and they offer even more protection because they're used to dealing with foreign clients. They're used to understanding the legal cultural differences. They don't assume that you know the French legal process and the nuances within the French legal process. And just as an aside, Simon mentioned about the translation of documents, making sure that those translations are accurate. Well, actually, from my point of view, that's only part of the story because even if it's an accurate translation, do you really know what particular French legal structure that's being referred to and how that's actually applied? That's why you actually need additional advice to be able to properly understand what you're signing. Next question, is it true that I may not be able to leave my French property to whomever I wish? And the short answer is yes. And that's because under French law, there is forced heirship. What's forced heirship? Forced heirship is a set of rules that is mandatory. You must give a part of your property to your children on the first death. So even if you're married, part of the property has to go to your children on the first death. Put simply, if you have one child, that child's entitled to 50% of your assets. If you have 2 children, they're entitled to 2/3. 3 children or more, they're entitled to 3/4 of your assets. However, since the 17th of August 2015, with implementation of the European Succession Regulation, it's been possible to make a choice of law called an election. And you can elect for the laws of your nationality to apply to the devolution of your estate. That election has to be done properly for it to be properly enforceable. As an aside, though, or on the other side of the argument, is elections are not always a good idea. There can be major adverse tax consequences if, for example, you give everything to your spouse and then to your stepchildren on the second death. In those cases, the stepchildren could potentially be liable to 60% tax on the amount they receive from the property, whereas children might not actually be taxed at all because they have a €100,000 tax-free allowance. Trusts are a potential problem. So for those US individuals who may be watching this, it's very common in the US for trusts to be used for estate planning. They're a really, really terrible idea in France. I can't stress that enough. Could attract tax of up to 83%. Also beware of matrimonial property regimes. These are marriage contracts. People sometimes enter into them without even knowing they're entering into them. They can apply to individual assets as well as to their entire overall assets, matrimonial assets. The other thing to bear in mind are ownership structures such as tontine. Again, you need advice on all of these issues because some of these structures are very useful and some of them are less useful. Finally, the B word, Brexit. So a really important one, this. From an estate planning point of view, Brexit will make no difference, okay? And the reason it'll make no difference is because with the European Succession Regulation, the UK opted out of the EU regulation, which means the UK, under the regulation, is already treated as a state outside the EU. So when the UK leaves the EU, it will still be a state outside the EU. So there'll be no difference in terms of planning. Finally, we're offering a free buyer's guide to all people who attended this the seminar. If you ask FrenchEntrée to pass your details to us, Stone King, and if you ask them to pass those details for the purpose of providing you with information relating to the purchase of French property, then we'll be able to send you a copy of that guide. And that brings me to the end of my formal presentation. So over to Alistair to fire some questions at me.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you, Dan. Brilliant. Have a well-earned glass of water while I just source some questions here. So a couple of quick questions for you, hopefully easy ones. Can a notaire in Paris be used for a property purchase in Nice?
Yes.
Good.
So let me elaborate. So there's nothing stopping you from using a notaire in any part of the country. So there are two arguments to this. I'm going to try and be as fair as I possibly can. Arguably, there may be some benefits in using a local notaire, local to the property, because that notaire may have some personal information about the property. More the case this is in rural areas than it is in urban areas. You know, there is that advantage. However, what we do as a firm is we use specialist cross-border notaires because we know that they will provide the best possible service to overseas clients because they understand, that fundamentally understand, the legal cultural differences between France and overseas jurisdictions.
Great. Thank you very much. What is this might be a big question, but what is the probate law in France for real estate in leaving property to someone who lives outside of France?
Okay, so but probate is governed by the European Succession Regulation 650/2012, also known as Brussels 4. This particular piece of legislation is much misunderstood by French lawyers. Okay, now we spend an awful lot of our time advising French lawyers on the law in their own jurisdiction. And it's not because we're fantastically brilliant lawyers, it's because we specialize in the area. And it's exactly the same with local lawyers in the UK and local lawyers in Australia or local lawyers in the US. They don't understand the cross-border issues even in their own jurisdictions. And that's again, it's not a criticism of them. It's simply because they don't specialize in this area. And it is a very specialist area. So the European succession regulation, which came in, as I say, the rules say, and I'll try and explain this as simply as I can. The rules say, Article 21 of the regulation specifies that the laws of your habitual residence will apply to the devolution of your estate. So people often think, well, hang on a second, if I'm just buying a holiday home, I'm habitually resident in the UK, then UK law applies, happy days. But it's not as easy as that. Because what UK law does is UK law makes a distinction between movable and immovable property. Movable property passes under the laws of your domicile, and don't be fooled into thinking domicile is the same as habitual residence. It's not. Domicile is a very complex concept, which you will almost certainly not lose for a significant period of time, even if you move to France. So Article 21 says, sorry, I beg your pardon, UK makes a distinction between movable and immovable assets. Movable assets pass under the laws of your domicile. Immovable assets, so that's buildings and land, pass in accordance to the law of the jurisdiction in which the property is situated. Okay. Now, if you've taken the proper action under the European succession regulation, then you can block that from happening, and you can effectively draft the documentation so the French property is treated as though it's on British soil. One final point on this, the UK is a federal jurisdiction. The laws in England and Wales are different to the laws in Scotland and Northern Ireland. Okay, so it really does depend which particular jurisdiction you're most closely connected to.
Great. Thank you very much, Dan. I've got a few more questions for you, excuse me, but we'll come to those at the end when we do our quick fire round. So thank you very much for your presentation. That's excellent. So what I'm going to quickly do now is launch the second poll. So fingers on buzzers. Let me just find it here before we go and talk to Sheila. So let me go back. How do I get out of that? So question 2. The question 2 is really around timeframes, which is particularly pertinent given the situation that everybody's in at the moment. When are you looking to buy your property in France? So voting is open now. When are you looking to buy your property in France? As soon as the borders open, within 3 to 6 months, 6 to 12 months, or are you looking more than a year out at this stage? So we've got a few more seconds left on the voting here. Beginning to slow down. Right, I'm going to close the voting now and share the results with you. So 15%, pretty much as soon as we can, physically get to France and visit properties. Looks like within the next 3 to 6 months has the majority at 32%, and then pretty even Stevens between 6 to 12 and 12 months plus. So that's very useful information. Thank you very much, everybody, for taking part. So last but not least, I would like to introduce Sheila Gorham from Agence Newton, who has been exceptionally patient. And I'm going to hand the baton over to Sheila now, and then once Sheila's finished, we will go through as many of the questions that remain unanswered as we possibly can. So over to you, Sheila.
Thank you, Alistair. Good morning, everybody from not so sunny Normandy here in rural France. I was hoping I'd have blue sky behind me this morning to make you all want to flock over here, but unfortunately that's not the case. So as Alistair said, I'm Sheila. I've worked over here for an estate agency for 12 years now, so know the market particularly well. The estate agents over here are fully licensed. We're not just house showers, we are midway between an estate agent and a solicitor. So whilst you still need the helps of Dan and notaires, we do help prepare the initial dossiers. So what's happening over here in the market at the moment? Well, the market here is stable. We don't have the peaks and troughs that you experience in the UK with prices. However, we have experienced since the end of lockdown a rush with French citizens wanting to move out of the cities and into the countryside. And we're finding our rural country properties are actually selling faster than we can get them signed up. The most popular areas, it's always Brittany first with us, followed closely by Normandy, and then going down into the centre of France, into the Limousin, and further south to the Périgord and Quercy regions. But that could change, who knows? One of the questions I always get asked is who actually pays the agency fees? It's a big debate, and in short, the answer is the buyer. Whilst some agencies may advertise that the seller pays the agency fees, it's all included in the overall price that you're seeing advertised. So whether it's paid from the money that the seller receives when you buy, or whether you're paying the money to the notaire is irrelevant. All the numbers add up to the same at the end of the day. Please also note when you see a property price advertised that notaire's fees and any additional fees you have to pay for Dan or any other solicitors, any other services will be on top of the price you see advertised. Moving on to COVID and what we're doing with that at the moment, how we're managing. Many of you coming from the UK may have seen the announcement made by Brittany Ferries 2 days ago that they have now cancelled all passenger bookings until the 28th of June. We are obviously waiting for you to be allowed to come over here, not just from the UK on the ferries, but of course from further afield on flights. As of yesterday, it was announced that President Macron will make a speech to the French at 8 o'clock on Sunday evening. So we're hoping that we will have further news after Sunday evening of what's going to happen with our borders. For those of you that aren't fluent in French, you are able to watch a translated version of his announcements on the Sky Channel France 24 in English, where you will see him making the speech live with an interpreter. So you can keep yourselves completely up to date with what the French announcements are. We have very strict regulations for when you are allowed to visit. As I said, at the moment, we now have plenty of French clients viewing. All viewers and us have to wear masks. That is obligatory. We will not take anyone to view if they are not wearing a mask. We have hand gel in the car that we ask you to apply before and leaving the property. We ask the seller, should they be on site, that they open all of the doors, they turn on all of the lights, and we request that the clients don't touch anything. If they do, if you accidentally touch your handle, which is easily done because it's the natural thing that we want to do, we also have antiseptic wipes so that we have to wipe the door handle after you've touched it. And normally we would drive you in our cars, but at the moment that's also forbidden. So it means we have to drive very slowly and you have to follow us. Every precaution is being taken. As Dan has said and Simon mentioned, we can also arrange for proxies. So therefore the notaires and solicitors will draw up procurations and you can sign without having to be able to come over to France with the regulations as they are at the moment. Moving on slightly, as the others have mentioned, Brexit. Our understanding at the moment, under the terms of the withdrawal agreement, are that anybody who is living in France before the 31st of December 2020 will automatically be able to enjoy the same citizens' rights that we currently have at the moment. That includes the rights to work, the rights to your health, the rights for your pensions, etc. We cannot answer any questions at this moment in time as to what will happen from the 1st of January onwards. So those of you that are seriously thinking about coming to live in France, we would advise if you can be here, living here before the 31st, it would make life a lot easier. Everybody from whichever country you move here from will be required now by law to have a carte de séjour, which is a citizen's residence card. A residence card, the French have been very helpful in us with this, in the fact that they have now put up a new online system in English that will go live from July. There will be various criteria. You will have to show that you are here and you are trying to get into the system and pay your tax here. There will be minimum income levels applied, which are currently in line with the basic wage. And we can provide you with the current minimum allowances that you can have on that. The reason that they're introducing minimum earnings is so that they don't think anybody will move here and be a burden on the state. If you own your own home and you haven't got a mortgage and maybe your income doesn't quite meet the criteria, then of course there is going to be some flexibility. But those are individual discussions that you would have with your prefecture. So it would be a good advice to start getting the photocopying done before you come here. You're going to need photocopies of your passports, your birth certificates, your marriage certificates, any divorces that you may have had, the certificates that go with those as well. Please don't burn them afterwards. As one client said to me this week, I haven't got my divorce certificate, I burnt it. Well, I'm sorry, but we're going to have to get a copy. There's lots of paperwork that you will be asked for on more than one occasion. So not only do we want you to do lots of photocopies, but also try and learn a bit of French, because that will help you greatly with the system. There are also new systems that are being put in place for you to register your British car if you want to bring that over. You're no longer allowed to drive around on British plates forever. You have 3 months to change your car. So once again, more photocopies will be needed. I think that's really me for now. I think I've nearly had my 10 minutes. It's surprisingly how quick it goes, but I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sheila. That is perfect. Well done. And yes, it is a shame that the sky isn't blue, but still you're able to sit outside and I'm not. So there's the difference. So thank you very much for that. So what I'm going to do now is this might be slightly risky depending on what's going on in the background, but I'm going to unmute our panelists. Let me just bear with me a second. So I've unmuted our panelists, and what I'm going to do now is rattle through as many of the questions that are left as I can. I'll probably not ask the ones which are sort of super macro strategic questions that would require, you know, an evening and a couple of bottles of wine to answer. You know, thank you very much for those questions, but unfortunately they're not necessarily ones that we would be able to necessarily answer in the next sort of 5-10 minutes before everybody has to shoot off. So I will just rattle through them now, and then feel free to put your hand up. If it's obvious who should be answering it, I'll point it in your direction. But if it's up for grabs, then feel free to put your hand up. So I think this is one for Sheila. We are selling our property in France and paying the agent's fees from the price of the sale. I thought that agent's fees were the responsibility of the seller, but I've seen properties for sale with frais inclus, which I assume means that the buyer pays, with an hors frais price also shown. I'm a little bit confused.
Okay, we touched on that briefly when I mentioned it. The fees, you will have the net vendor price, which is the amount that the seller will receive for their property. You have the agency fee, you have VAT or TVA as it's known in France, and then in addition you have the notaire's fees. The price that you see advertised includes the agency fee, and it depends on the setup of the agency if they receive the money from the buyer or the seller. Ultimately, you would be paying the same amount for that property regardless. It could be that, say for example, you're buying a property for 100,000, there's a 5,000 agency fee on top, so 105,000. You would be paying the notaire 105,000, and then the notaire would then give the money to the seller and to the agency. Ultimately, you're going to be paying the same amount, whichever way it's worded.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. Dan.
Yeah, I can probably add a little bit to that. I mean, like Guy, I've owned properties in France, and when you come to sell a property, you go to the estate agents and you negotiate the price that they're going to get for you as a seller. And then on top of that, they put on their margin. So effectively, it is the buyer who ends up paying the estate agent fees. When it comes to notaires fees, those are generally negotiable, but in the vast majority of cases, it's paid by the buyer. Our solicitors' fees are always going to be paid by the buyer.
Great, thanks, Dan. I'm not sure whether this is for Dan or Sheila, but feel free to jump in. So somebody's planning on buying a retirement property in France, but not for a few years. Because of the Brexit word, would it be better for them to buy a small flat now, before the 31st of December, so that they're in the system, and then buy a larger property later, or will it make no difference?
Yeah, if I could just answer that one. It depends if they're going to come and live in their small flat. If they're buying the property as a holiday home and with the view to moving to France in a few years' time, then no, it makes no difference, because you have to be living here full time for Brexit to make the difference to you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Dan.
So sorry, if I can if I can add a little bit about residency. So it's worth bearing in mind that for people moving from the UK, their UK residency isn't going to drop off a cliff. It's not going to end suddenly. The rules in the UK and in France, for that matter, are quite complicated in terms of residency. So it may be that you end up being resident in both jurisdictions. It may also be, in fact, it's highly likely that you'll remain domiciled in the UK for a significant period of time after you've left. So the minimum amount of time you'll remain domiciled in the UK after you've left and moved to France, even if you move everything lock, stock and barrel, will be 4 years. Okay, in that time, you're still liable to UK inheritance tax on your worldwide estate. Although there is a double taxation convention, 1963 double taxation convention, which regulates the taxation and ensures that you don't pay tax in both jurisdictions. However, as with all of these things, you always end up paying the higher of the two taxes.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dan. Ma, question for you. Could you give us some idea of what's happening with the Australian dollar?
Yes, the Australian dollar actually is a funny currency in the sense that we can see some volatility, and when the volatility happens, it's quite intense. And actually, in the last couple of weeks, we've seen the Australian dollar actually getting strong against major currencies. We've seen a 10% movement against the pound and a little bit less against the euro. And it's been mainly because they recovered very well from COVID-19, and a bit that thing that I mentioned when I talk about the US dollar, the fact that the global market is a bit more confident now, normally means that there is a risk appetite and currencies like the Australian dollar suddenly are being bought into. However, this morning there was some bad news, some data saying, I believe, that the Australian economic growth is predicted to fall by 5%. This is affecting slightly the currency, but in general terms, it's a great moment for Australian holders to actually change their funds and look into maximising their opportunities.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Simon, question for you. So somebody here is saying that their employer, their employer will support their move by moving their contract, presumably their employment contract, to France with all social payments, etc., and pay them in euros. What they're trying to work out is whether they would be better to get a French mortgage, if that's possible, or to save the cash and to save the cash to achieve a better rate of return over time.
Oh, that's partly an investment question, because it's where they put the money. If they bought the mortgage, yeah, we can arrange the mortgage if they're moving with their employer. With the problem we have with a lot of people is that they move and then they change jobs and change employer, and then you've got to wait for probationary periods and length of time. If you're moving with the same employer, and it doesn't matter whether you're going to be earning in euros or whether you're going to be earning in pounds, we can still help. Where they put the money for a better return, and currency, that's a currency issue, and also B, where they're going to invest, and I'm not an IFA.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. Dan?
So sorry, I can probably also add something here on pensions. There's as a firm of solicitors, we're neither regulated nor authorized to provide advice specifically on pensions or financial investments at all. However, we're allowed to make generic comments, and the generic comment would be that it is technically possible to move your pension to France. However, that's not necessarily a good idea, and I'm sure FrenchEntrée can put you in touch with cross-border financial advisors who'd be able to advise you properly on pensions, as can we.
Brilliant, thanks, Dan. I think a quick question for you, Dan. So it's sort of related to the residency question. So I plan to establish residence in France this year. Normally you are required to spend at least 6 months and 1 day in France to maintain residence. What is the position when you start residence partway through the year? How many days can be spent outside France?
So this is actually more of an immigration question than a property question. The issue with residence in France is obviously, and the reason it's a hot topic now is because it determines what happens after the 31st of December. Basically, that's the sort of question that we would get the answer to through our cross-border notaires. In part because the position is constantly changing, not just because of Brexit, but because of COVID-19. And there's a relaxation of rules really in all jurisdictions that we're dealing with, relaxation of rules across the board. So I think that's a very specific question that would have to be given a specific answer.
Sure, no, that's fine. Thanks for that. Sheila, Sheila, quick question for you. What exactly do you have to do to beat the Brexit deadline to still benefit from being part of the EU? Does the property sale need to complete?
Yes, the property sale needs to complete by the end of December. Ideally, you need to have been making your offer on the property, I would say, by early October, in order to allow plenty of time for the completion to happen before the end of December, as completions here can take 8-10 weeks because of the various procedures that we have to go through. So I would say, yeah, early October for your offer at the very latest.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Simon, quick question for you. If you've got a mortgage offer agreed in principle, but then there is a delay in the purchase process, is that problematic, or are the lenders happy to extend that agreement in principle?
Yeah, it varies from lender to lender. You can extend between 3 and 6 months depending on the lender. Okay,
perfect. I'm just rattling through here. So there's a question from Mar, which I'm just trying to track down here. Can you explain a little bit more about the option to buy within a range of rates?
Yeah, I believe I mentioned on one of the tips that normally what I advise the clients is to have a range of rate in your mind, ideally the rate that you would like to achieve and the rate beyond which you will not be able to afford to buy the property to feel comfortable. You could monitor this range yourselves. Also, if you want to be a little bit more assertive, you could potentially put an order to try to track that particular rate and put what is called a stop loss limit in trying to protect yourself from the lower rate. So it's like if you are saying to your dealer, if the market goes to 115, please buy my currency. And if the market suddenly falls down and it looks like it's going to go beyond 110, please buy my currency before we get beyond 110. It's a way of protecting your budget, basically.
Okay, perfect. Simon.
Just going back on the earlier question about delay, there's another caveat to be prepared about that. If it goes too long, so if it goes over the 6 months, because that can happen, all different matters come into it, then you've got to be prepared to get up-to-date financial statements. So that means bank statements, pay slips. If it drifts on too long and it goes into another trading year, if you're self-employed, maybe up-to-date tax returns as well. So just be aware, the longer it drifts out, because banks are wary that your circumstances may change, so they may come back to you for more information.
Okay, brilliant, perfect. There's interestingly a couple of questions about renting a property. So this is clearly individuals trying to work out if there's a way of getting into France before the end of the year as renters rather than owners of property. I don't know if Dan or Sheila, you've come across that as a potential sort of loophole that people are trying to use. Sheila?
Yes, I have, and my understanding as it is at the moment, obviously, as we've said, regulations are changing daily. If they've got a formal rental agreement that shows that, you know, they're in France paying rent at this particular property, then that will be counted towards residency.
Brilliant. Okay, Dan?
It's also, Sheila can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but my understanding is that rental in France is actually very common. There are fewer, in the UK, we love the idea of owning our own house. And that's why, you know, when we go to France, we're not thinking of renting, we're thinking of buying a place. But in France, rental is much more common, and it's very tightly regulated as well, very tightly regulated. So you know, if you're thinking in terms of having a property and having tenants in it, it can be actually quite difficult to get them out if you want to get them out.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I think that we will wrap up there as we're approaching, fast approaching 11:45. We've got quite a number of questions that left to go through. So what we will do is we will come back to you following the session and we'll try and answer those questions as best we can. What we're planning on doing is not only when we send out a recording of this session to everybody who registered to attend, what we'll also do is we'll go through the questions that you asked. I mean, we could literally sit here all day and plow through them, and that would be thoroughly enjoyable, but I'm sure we've all got other things that we want to be getting on with. But we'll come back to you and try and answer as many of the questions as we can. If we can't answer the question directly, which is eminently possible, if you've got a very specific inquiry, then we'll certainly point you in the direction of somebody who hopefully can answer your question. All that remains to be said is thank you very much to our panelists for your time today. Thank you very much to everybody who has committed to spending a couple of hours with us this morning on our pilot FrenchEntrée webinar. Hope that you found it useful and enjoyable, and we wish you the very best of luck with your search in France. We will make sure that when we send out the information to you after the webinar, that you have means to come back to us here at FrenchEntrée. I'm happy to have a chat with anybody and answer any questions that you might have, as I'm sure Guy is, and we'll certainly make sure that we can point you in the right direction when you come back to us. So thank you very much. If I can get all of our panelists to give a cheesy smile and a wave, please, and say goodbye. Excellent. Thank you very much. And we hope to see you, if we get commissioned for a full series, we hope to see you on the next one. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day and the weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alistair. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.